Father sold his pregnant fat daughter to a mountain man as punishment, but what he did to her will leave you speechless. In a dusty frontier town, a cruel rancher drags his own daughter into the saloon and shames her before the crowd. 1 silver coin changes her life forever. She's handed to the loneliest, most feared man in the mountains, but instead of chains, he gives her shelter. Instead of scorn, he gives her honor. And as snowstorms rage outside their cabin, whispers spread through town, because her unborn child carries more than a legacy of shame. It carries a hidden claim to land her father will stop at nothing to control. Soon, jail doors slam, church bells toll, and thundering hooves echo across the valley. The law itself turns against them, and the mountain man must choose between vengeance and mercy, even as the child's first cry draws near. Will this unlikely bond save her, or destroy them both when family, faith, and frontier justice collide? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The saloon doors banged open, startling the afternoon crowd. Ephraim Dunn's heavy boots thundered across the wooden floor as he dragged his daughter Mary Beth behind him. Her plain brown dress was wrinkled from his grip, and her face flushed with shame. The usual chatter died away as heads turned to watch the scene unfold. "Look here!" Ephraim's voice boomed through the suddenly quiet room. "Look what my own flesh and blood has done!" He yanked Mary Beth forward, causing her to stumble. Her hands instinctively went to her swollen belly, protecting the child within. The regulars at the bar set down their drinks. Even old Jim behind the counter stopped wiping glasses. Mary Beth kept her eyes fixed on the sawdust-covered floor, unable to meet the stares of the townspeople she'd known all her life. "Ruined!" Ephraim spat the word like poison. "Sneaking off to marry some no-account railroad worker who got himself killed before he could make an honest woman of her." He gestured at her rounded middle. "Now she's carrying his bastard, bringing shame to the Dunn name." Mary Beth's shoulders shook with silent sobs. The silver cross at her neck caught the dim light as she trembled. Someone at a corner table whispered, and a few women turned away, unable to watch. "Well, I won't have it," Ephraim declared. His face was red with rage and drink. "Won't have her or her brat under my roof." He grabbed Mary Beth's arm again, making her wince. "So here's my offer. Who'll take her off my hands? Name your price." The silence grew deeper. Men shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A few reached for their drinks, desperate for something to do besides meet Ephraim's wild-eyed stare. The scrape of a chair broke the tension. From the darkest corner of the saloon, a tall figure rose. Luis Cutter's scarred face emerged from the shadows as he approached the bar. Women drew back, and men straightened in their seats. The mountain man rarely came to town, and his presence always caused a stir. Luis reached into his worn leather vest and pulled out a single silver dollar. The coin rang like a bell as he set it on the bar and slid it toward Ephraim. A cruel smile twisted Ephraim's face. "Well, well. The mountain man wants my ruined daughter." He laughed harshly. "Fitting end for a whore, ain't it?" Before anyone could blink, Luis moved, but instead of violence, he simply shrugged off his heavy coat. With gentle hands, he draped it around Mary Beth's shoulders. The rough wool engulfed her trembling form, offering warmth and a shield from the stairs. Ephraim's smile faltered. This wasn't the reaction he'd expected. "She's yours then," he sneered, shoving Mary Beth toward Luis. "Good riddance to bad blood." Luis steadied Mary Beth with a careful touch to her elbow. His other hand gathered the coat more securely around her. Without a word, he guided her toward the door, his broad shoulders between her and the watching crowd. The saloon remained silent as they stepped out into the street. The afternoon sun was harsh after the dim interior, making Mary Beth blink back tears. Townsfolk stopped to stare as Luis led her past the general store and the blacksmith's shop. "Did you see?" someone whispered. "Ephraim Dunn sold his own daughter." To Louise Cutter, of all people. Poor girl. Mary Beth hunched deeper into Louise's coat, trying to make herself smaller despite her size. Her steps faltered, uncertain. Was this rescue or damnation? The mountain man's reputation for solitude and ferocity was well known, yet his touch remained gentle as he guided her forward. They stopped at the hitching post where Louise's mule waited patiently. The creature's long ears twitched at their approach, but it stood quietly as Louise turned to Mary Beth. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low and rough from disuse, "may I help you up?" Mary Beth nodded, unable to find her voice. Louise's hands were strong but careful as he helped her settle sideways on the mule's broad back, mindful of her condition. The coat wrapped around her like armor against the cooling evening air and curious stares. Louise adjusted the stirrups, then took the mule's lead rope. Without a backward glance at the town or the saloon, where lamplight was beginning to flicker in the windows, he started walking. The mule's hooves clip-clopped on the packed dirt of the street, falling into an easy rhythm. Mary Beth gripped the pommel of the old Mexican saddle, her other hand still pressed protectively against her middle. Behind them, she could hear murmurs and whispers floating on the evening breeze. Ahead lay the unknown, a journey into the mountains with a man whose reputation inspired fear and wild tales. The sun was sinking toward the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Louise's boots made no sound as he walked, leading them steadily away from the only home Mary Beth had ever known. She glanced back once at the town growing smaller behind them, then faced forward again, shoulders straight despite her fear. The mule plodded onward, its steady gait gentle enough for her condition. Louise remained silent, but his presence was oddly reassuring, solid and certain as the mountains themselves. The coat around her shoulders carried the scent of wood smoke and pine, so different from the familiar smells of her father's ranch. As they left the last buildings behind, Mary Beth felt tears sliding down her cheeks. Not just for herself and her uncertain future, but for the father whose pride and cruelty had driven him to sell his own daughter, for her secret husband taken too soon, and for the child within her who would never know its grandfather's love. The purple shadows lengthened across the trail. A cool breeze stirred the aspens, making their leaves dance silver in the fading light. Louise kept walking, leading them higher into the hills where his cabin waited. Behind them, the town's lamplight flickered like fallen stars, growing more distant with each step. The mountain trail wound higher into the hills as the afternoon light began to fade. Louise's boots crunched steadily on the rocky path, while he led the mule carrying Mary Beth. The wind grew sharper with each turn of the trail, cutting through Louise's coat that still wrapped around her shoulders. Mary Beth gripped the saddle horn tighter as another gust swept down from the peaks. Her teeth chattered despite her best efforts to stay still. Every few minutes, Louise would glance back at her, his dark eyes checking her position on the mule's broad back. Though he said nothing, his attention never wavered far from her safety. The mule's ears flicked forward and back, its sure feet finding purchase on the steep path. Patches of old snow lingered in the shadowed places between the pines. Their branches swayed overhead, whispering secrets to the darkening sky. The sun was settling behind the western peaks now, painting the clouds in deep purples and golds. Louis paused at a bend in the trail, letting the mule rest. Without a word, he reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a worn wool blanket. His hands were gentle as he tucked it around Mary Beth's legs, shielding her from the mountain cold. She whispered a quiet, "Thank you," but Louis had already turned back to the trail, leading them onward and upward. As twilight deepened into dusk, a familiar scent reached Louis's nose. Wood smoke. They rounded one final bend, and there in a small clearing stood his cabin. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, rising straight up in the still evening air. Louis had banked the morning's fire well, letting it smolder all day while he was in town. The cabin was small but solid, built of thick pine logs chinked with mud and moss. A tin roof gleamed dully in the last light. Near the door, split firewood was stacked neat and high against the coming winter. It wasn't much, but it was home. Louise helped Mary Beth down from the mule, steadying her as her stiff legs found the ground. She swayed slightly, one hand pressed to her lower back where the long ride had left her aching. Louise pretended not to notice, giving her a moment to collect herself while he led the mule to its lean-to shelter. When he returned, Mary Beth stood where he'd left her, uncertain. The wind had picked up again, and she pulled his coat tighter around her shoulders. Louise stepped past her to open the cabin door, gesturing for her to enter first. The cabin's interior was dark and cool. Louise moved surely through the shadows, finding the old tin lantern that hung by the hearth. The match flared bright in his hands, and soon golden light filled the single room. Mary Beth blinked, taking in her surroundings. The cabin was spare but neat. A rough-hewn table stood under the window, 2 chairs pushed beneath it. The stone fireplace dominated one wall, its wooden mantel holding a few battered tin cups and plates. A narrow bed was tucked in one corner, while a larger one filled the opposite corner. Dried herbs hung from the rafters, filling the air with their dusty sweetness. Louise moved to the fire, adding kindling and logs until flames crackled to life. From a trunk near the larger bed, he pulled out a colorful quilt. The fabric was soft with age and use as he settled it around Mary Beth's shoulders, replacing his coat. She traced one finger along the careful stitching, recognizing the pattern as one her mother used to make. "Sit," Louise said, his voice rough from disuse. He gestured to one of the chairs by the table. Mary Beth sank into it gratefully, her legs trembling with exhaustion. Louise turned to the hearth, where a covered pot hung from an iron hook. He lifted the lid, releasing the rich smell of venison stew. Using a long-handled spoon, he filled a tin bowl and set it before her with a piece of dark bread. Mary Beth's stomach growled at the smell, reminding her she hadn't eaten since morning. Still, she hesitated, her hand hovering over the spoon. "Eat," Louise said quietly. "You need strength." He turned away, giving her privacy as he tended to the fire. Mary Beth took a cautious bite. The stew was simple but good, the meat tender, and the broth rich with herbs. She found herself finishing the bowl quickly, hunger overcoming her nervousness. When she was done, Louise wordlessly filled it again. The reality of her situation crashed over her then. Sold by her own father, carried away to this remote cabin, dependent on the mercy of a man she barely knew. The spoon clattered against the bowl as her hands began to shake. Tears welled up and spilled over before she could stop them. Louise's boots scraped against the wooden floor as he turned. He stood uncertain for a moment, then spoke in a voice gentle despite its roughness. "You're safe here," he said. "No harm will come to you under my roof." The words were simple, but something in his tone carried the weight of a solemn vow. Mary Beth could only nod, wiping her tears with the corner of the quilt. Louise returned to the fire, adding another log. The flames cast his scarred profile in sharp relief against the darkness beyond the window. When the second bowl was empty and her tears had dried, Louise showed her to the narrow bed in the corner. "My wife's quilt," he said softly, touching the fabric around Mary Beth's shoulders. "She would have wanted you to have it." Then he turned away, settling himself in the chair by the hearth. Mary Beth lay down, fully clothed, pulling the quilt close around her. The bed smelled of lavender and cedar, a feminine touch in this bachelor's cabin. She watched through half-closed eyes as Louise stared into the flames, his shoulders bent as if carrying an invisible weight. Old grief seemed to hang about him like a shadow. The fire popped and crackled, casting dancing light across the cabin's walls. Outside, the wind sang in the pines, a lonely lullaby. Despite her fears and uncertainty, exhaustion soon pulled Mary Beth into fitful sleep. She woke to pale light filtering through the window and the soft sound of an axe splitting wood. The fire had burned low, but the cabin was still warm. A fresh blanket of snow had fallen in the night, transforming the clearing outside into a world of white. Through the window, she could see Luis at the chopping block, his breath forming clouds in the cold morning air. His movements were sure and steady as he split kindling for the day ahead. The pile of wood grew beside him, each piece carefully stacked. Mary Beth pushed herself up slowly, her body stiff from the previous day's ride. The quilt slipped from her shoulders as she stood, and she caught it, folding it carefully before laying it on the bed. Her father's cruel words still echoed in her mind, but here in the morning light, they seemed to have less power. Moving quietly, she went to the table. It was cluttered with tin plates and cups from previous meals. With determined hands, she began to gather them, searching until she found a wash basin and some soap. It wasn't much, but it was a start. A small way to begin making a place for herself in this strange new home. The sound of chopping continued outside as she worked, steady as a heartbeat. When Luis came in with an armload of kindling, he paused in the doorway, seeing the neat stack of clean dishes on the table. Mary Beth stiffened, uncertain of his reaction to her presumption. But Luis simply nodded, a quick duck of his head that might have been approval. He moved to the hearth, laying the kindling carefully to build up the fire. As morning light filled the cabin, the flames caught and grew, promising warmth against the snowy day ahead. The morning sun climbed higher, warming the fresh snow outside the cabin window. Inside, Luis stood beside the iron cook stove, demonstrating how to adjust its dampeners. Mary Beth watched intently, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Too much air. Fire burns too hot," Luis explained, his rough voice gentle. "Too little, it dies." Like this, he showed her how to slide the metal plate that controlled the airflow. The flames inside responded immediately, settling into a steady burn. Mary Beth nodded, committing the motion to memory. "I reckon it's like the kitchen range back home, just smaller." She reached out to try the adjustment herself, her movements careful but determined. Luis stepped back, giving her space to practice. He watched as she made small adjustments, learning the stove's temperament. Despite her size and the awkwardness of her advanced pregnancy, her hands were sure and steady. "Good," he said simply when she got it right. The praise was brief, but Mary Beth's cheeks colored slightly at the approval. They moved on to other tasks. Luis showed her where he kept the dried goods, beans, flour, coffee, stored in tin cans to keep out mice. He demonstrated how to work the pump at the indoor wash basin, warning her it sometimes needed extra pressure in cold weather. When it came time to bring in more firewood, Mary Beth insisted on helping. She waddled to the door, determined to carry her share. Luis started to protest but saw the set of her jaw and thought better of it. Instead, he handed her smaller pieces while taking the heavier logs himself. On her third trip, Mary Beth stumbled slightly under her load. Luis was there instantly, steadying her with a strong hand at her elbow. "Enough," he said firmly. "Rest now." Mary Beth started to object, but her back was aching, and her breath came short. She allowed Luis to guide her to a chair by the table. "I want to help," she said softly. "I'm not made of glass." Luis's scarred face softened slightly. "No, you're stronger than that." He turned away to stack the wood, but Mary Beth caught the respect in his tone. As afternoon settled into evening, Mary Beth helped prepare a simple supper of beans and cornbread. They ate in comfortable silence until Mary Beth gathered her courage to ask the question that had been weighing on her mind. "Mr. Cutter," she began hesitantly, "why do you live way up here all alone?" Luis's hand stilled, his spoon halfway to his mouth. For a long moment, Mary Beth thought he wouldn't answer. When he did, his voice was rough with old pain. "Had a wife once, Sarah, and a boy." He set his spoon down carefully. "Fever took them both. 6 years ago now." "I'm sorry," Mary Beth whispered, her heart aching for his loss. Luis pushed back from the table. "Dishes need washing," he said gruffly, ending the conversation. Later, as Mary Beth prepared for bed, Luis cleared his throat awkwardly. "Door has a lock," he said, not meeting her eyes. "Use it if it eases your heart." Mary Beth looked at him then, really looked at him. She saw the grief etched in the lines of his face, the careful way he held himself apart. But she also saw the gentle hands that had steadied her, the quiet respect in his manner. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." Luis nodded once and turned away. Mary Beth watched him settle into his chair by the fire before closing the bedroom door. She didn't lock it. In the quiet darkness, Mary Beth remembered the comfort she'd always found in Scripture. Her mother had taught her many psalms before she passed, and one came to her now. In a clear, sweet voice, she began to recite, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures." Through the door, Luis sat motionless by the fire, listening to the familiar words. His hands clenched once on the arms of his chair, but he made no sound. The psalm continued, filling the cabin with its ancient promise of comfort and protection. When morning came, bringing with it a pink-gold sunrise over the snow, a knock at the door startled them both. Luis answered it to reveal a tall native man, dressed in a mixture of traditional and settler clothing. A string of smoked meat hung over his shoulder. "Henry," Luis greeted him with a nod. "Brother," Henry replied, his voice warm despite his watchful expression. His dark eyes moved past Luis to where Mary Beth stood uncertainly by the table. "This is Mary Beth," Luis said simply. He took the offered meat. "Much obliged." Henry inclined his head to Mary Beth in greeting. "Welcome to the mountain," he said, his English clear and precise. "The winter will be long, but spring always returns." Mary Beth recognized the kind wisdom in his words. "Thank you," she replied, matching his respectful tone. Henry stayed only long enough to share a cup of coffee, but his presence transformed the cabin. Where before it had seemed isolated, cut off from the world, now Mary Beth saw it was part of a larger community, one that might include her too. As Henry took his leave, he pressed a small packet wrapped in deerskin into Mary Beth's hands. "Tea," he explained. "Good for mother and child." His gesture acknowledged her condition without judgment, offering support instead of shame. Mary Beth clutched the packet, touched by this unexpected kindness from a stranger. "I'm much obliged," she said, the frontier phrase feeling natural on her tongue. Henry exchanged a long look with Luis before departing, some unspoken understanding passing between them. The door closed behind him, but the cabin felt warmer somehow, less lonely. Luis moved to hang the smoked meat while Mary Beth carefully unwrapped her gift. The herbs inside smelled of pine and something sweeter. She looked up to find Luis watching her, his expression thoughtful. "Henry's a good man," he said quietly. "Known him many years, helped me when—" He trailed off, but Mary Beth understood. Henry had been there after Luis lost his family. "There's kindness in this valley," she said softly, holding the packet of tea. "More than I expected." Luis turned back to his task, but not before Mary Beth saw something flicker in his eyes, perhaps a memory of other kindnesses, other hands reaching out in dark times. She set about brewing the tea, her movements more confident now in this space that was slowly becoming home. The morning light streamed through the window, catching the steam rising from her cup. Outside, Henry's tracks in the snow led down the mountain, a reminder that even here, they were not truly alone. The storm arrived with little warning. Dark clouds rolled over the mountains like a heavy blanket, bringing fierce winds that rattled the cabin's shutters. By nightfall, snow was falling so thick and fast that the world beyond the windows disappeared entirely. Mary Beth stood at the window, watching the white curtain of snow with growing unease. "Will the roof hold?" she asked, wincing as another gust howled through the eaves. Luis looked up from stoking the fire. "Cabin stood through worse." His voice was steady, reassuring. "Storm might last a couple days, though." He was right. The snow continued through the night and well into the next day, trapping them indoors. The wind found every crack and crevice, making the flames dance in the fireplace despite Luis's careful banking. To pass the time, Luis brought out a pile of leather straps that needed mending. He settled at the table and began sorting through them, his big hands surprisingly nimble with the small tools. Mary Beth watched with interest from her chair by the fire. "Could you show me?" she asked hesitantly. "I know sewing well enough, but leatherwork's different." Luis nodded and pulled his chair closer. He demonstrated how to punch the holes just so, how to thread the heavy cord through without splitting the leather. Mary Beth's first attempts were clumsy, but she persisted, her tongue caught between her teeth in concentration. "Like this?" she asked, holding up a newly mended strap. Luis examined her work carefully. "Good and strong," he said with approval. "Horse won't break that one." Mary Beth smiled, pleased by the praise. She set aside the leather work and insisted on preparing their midday meal, despite Luis's protests about her condition. "I may be carrying heavy," she said firmly, "but I can still cook a proper meal." She made thick bean soup with salt pork and the last of the cornbread, filling the cabin with warm, homey smells that almost drowned out the howling wind. Luis ate 2 full bowls, and though he said little, his appreciation showed in the careful way he sopped up every last drop with his bread. The second day passed much like the first, with leatherwork and cooking and long stretches of comfortable silence. Mary Beth found herself growing used to Luis's quiet ways, learning to read meaning in his subtle gestures and brief responses. On the morning of the third day, they woke to silence. The wind had died during the night, and weak sunlight filtered through the frost-covered windows. The world outside was transformed, buried under feet of fresh snow. "Need water," Luis said after breakfast. "Creek won't be frozen under all that snow." Mary Beth stood quickly. "I'll help carry." When Luis started to object, she added, "I need the fresh air, mister." Cutter. "Please." Luis studied her face for a moment, then nodded. He helped her bundle up in one of his old coats, which barely closed over her middle, and they stepped out into the glittering white world. The snow was deep, well past Mary Beth's knees in places. Luis broke trail ahead of her, trampling down a path toward the creek. Even so, walking was difficult. Mary Beth's breath came in white puffs as she struggled through the drifts. Halfway to the creek, her foot caught in a hidden dip. She stumbled forward with a startled cry. Luis turned instantly, catching her before she could fall. His hands were strong and steady on her arms, holding her until she found her balance. "I'm sorry," Mary Beth said, face flushing with embarrassment. "It's my size. I'm so clumsy with all this weight." Luis didn't let go right away. He waited until she met his eyes, his scarred face serious. "Strength comes in many forms," he said quietly. The simple words struck Mary Beth deeply. How long had it been since anyone had seen strength in her, rather than shame? She blinked back sudden tears, blaming the bright snow. They filled the water buckets at the creek, where dark water ran swift beneath a crust of ice. The walk back was easier, following their own tracks. Still, Mary Beth was grateful to return to the warmth of the cabin. As evening approached, she found herself thinking of Thomas, her secret husband. The snowbound quiet made memories rise up like ghosts. She sat in her usual chair by the fire, one hand resting on her swollen belly. "Thomas had such dreams," she said softly, almost to herself. But Luis turned from his place at the table, listening. "He worked for the railroad, you see. But he saw how the company was claiming more and more land. He wanted to secure our own place, somewhere we could raise a family proper. She smiled sadly. He was so careful, saving every penny. Said he had a plan to file claims before the speculators could grab everything up. But then the accident. She trailed off, swallowing hard. Luis sat very still, his face troubled in the firelight. He had heard rumors in town, whispers about Ephraim Dunn meeting with railroad men and land speculators. The pieces began fitting together in his mind like a grim puzzle. "Think I'll turn in early," Mary Beth said, pushing herself up from her chair. "Baby's restless tonight." She touched Luis's shoulder briefly as she passed. "Thank you for listening." Luis waited until he heard the bedroom door close. Then he pulled on his coat and stepped outside into the crystal-clear night. Stars blazed overhead, silver as new dimes, while his breath frosted in the bitter air. He stood for a long time, thinking about Ephraim Dunn's cruel smile in the saloon. The man's public show of shame over his daughter might have masked a deeper purpose. If Thomas had found a way to secure land rights that would now pass to his unborn child, Luis's hands clenched at his sides. He had thought Ephraim might return seeking simple revenge, but if the child Mary Beth carried represented not just his grandchild, but a legal claim to valuable land, the night air seemed colder suddenly. Luis looked back at the cabin, where lamplight glowed warm in the window. Inside, Mary Beth slept under his wife's old quilt, trusting in his protection. He would not fail that trust. A lone wolf howled in the distance, its cry echoing off the snow-covered peaks. Luis remained outside a while longer, keeping watch as the stars wheeled overhead, each one sharp as a blade against the black sky. A week of thawing weather turned the mountain paths treacherous with mud and slush. Luis helped Mary Beth onto his steadiest mule, checking the girth strap twice before they set out for town. The morning sun was deceivingly bright, but patches of dirty snow still clung to the shadows beneath the pines. "Supply run can wait if you're not feeling up to it," Luis said, noting how Mary Beth gripped the saddle horn. She shook her head firmly. "We need flour and salt, and—" she hesitated. "And I reckon it's time I showed folks I ain't hiding in shame." Luis nodded, respect warming his eyes. He took the mule's lead rope, and they started down the mountain trail, picking their way carefully through half-frozen mud and melting drifts. The journey took twice as long as usual, but Luis kept a patient pace. He stopped often to help Mary Beth stretch her legs, steadying her as she worked out the stiffness in her back. By the time they reached the outskirts of town, the sun had climbed high overhead. The streets were busy with Saturday traffic, wagons creaking through the mud, horses tied at hitching posts, townspeople hurrying about their business. As Luis led the mule down Main Street, conversation died away. Heads turned, whispers followed in their wake. "Ain't right," a woman muttered loudly enough to carry. "That mountain man buying himself a wife like she was property." "Look at the size of her," someone else snickered. "Reckon that's why her pa had to pay someone to take her." Mary Beth's cheeks burned, but she kept her chin up. Luis's hand tightened on the lead rope, though his face remained carefully blank. Outside the general store, Luis helped Mary Beth down from the mule. Her feet had barely touched the ground when Pastor Elliot hurried over from the church next door, his kind face creased with concern. "Mary Beth, child," he said warmly, taking her hands in his. "It does my heart good to see you well." He turned to Luis with obvious approval. "The Lord's work, what you did that night, mister. Cutter, though some folks lack the wisdom to see it." "Much obliged, Pastor," Luis said quietly. The older man glanced around before lowering his voice. "A word of warning, if I may. Your father's been meeting with Sheriff Avery regular this past week, Mary Beth. Closed-door meetings, with some railroad men present, too." Mary Beth's hand flew to her throat. "Railroad men." Luis touched her elbow gently. "Best get our supplies first. Then we can talk." Inside the store, Mary Beth tried to focus on their shopping list, but her hands trembled as she picked out flour and salt. She couldn't help overhearing two women gossiping by the fabric bolts. That Thomas fellow had found some way to file homestead claims before the railroad could snatch everything up, one woman was saying. Papers all legal and proper from what I heard, of course, now that he's dead. And the child inherits, the other finished. No wonder Ephraim's taking such an interest in his daughter's welfare all of a sudden. Mary Beth gripped the counter edge, understanding flooding through her. Thomas's secretive meetings, his careful plans, his excitement about securing their future, it all made terrible sense now. Her father wasn't after her out of shame or spite. He wanted her unborn child's claim to the land. Louise appeared at her side, laying a steadying hand on her back. "You all right?" She nodded shakily. "We need to leave. Please." They paid quickly for their supplies, Louise efficiently loading everything into his saddlebags. They were almost to the mule when a drunk ranch hand stumbled out of the saloon, pointing at them with a whiskey bottle. "Hey there, mountain man," he called out, slurring his words. "How much you want for a turn with your woman?" "Reckon I can afford whatever Ephraim's price was." The street went deadly quiet. Louise turned slowly, his scarred face impassive. The ranch hand swaggered forward, clearly spoiling for a fight. "Ain't you got no answer?" he sneered. "Or maybe you only talk to that fat—" "Sir," Louise cut in, his voice level but carrying clearly, "you've had too much to drink. Best go sleep it off before you say something that can't be taken back." The ranch hand blinked, wrong-footed by Louise's calm response. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, suddenly aware of the disapproving stares from the gathered crowd. Pastor Elliot stepped forward, taking the man's arm. "Come along now, Jacob," the pastor said firmly. "I'll walk you home." The moment broke. The ranch hand allowed himself to be led away, muttering under his breath. Louise helped Mary Beth back onto the mule without a word, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the careful control in his movements. They rode out of town in silence, the winter sun already sinking toward the mountains. It wasn't until they were well away from prying eyes that Mary Beth spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "My father means to take my baby." Her hands cradled her swollen belly protectively. "Thomas found a way to claim land before the railroad could. The rights would pass to our child. That's why Pa's meeting with the sheriff. He'll try to use the law somehow, say I'm not fit to be a mother, that he should have guardianship." Louise stopped the mule, turning to face her fully. In the slanting evening light, his scars stood out starkly against his weathered skin, but his eyes were gentle. "Listen to me," he said, his quiet voice fierce with conviction. "No man, not your father, not the sheriff, not anyone, will take your child while I draw breath. You have my word on that." Mary Beth stared at him, seeing not the fearsome mountain man others whispered about, but a protector who had shown her nothing but kindness and respect. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she nodded. "Thank you," she whispered. Louise squeezed her hand once, then turned to lead the mule onward. They continued their journey home as the sun set behind them, painting the snowy peaks in shades of gold and rose. Neither spoke again, but the silence between them was filled with understanding and shared purpose. The cabin waited ahead, a safe harbor in the gathering dusk. But both knew their peace there was borrowed time. Ephraim Dunn was making plans, and soon they would have to face whatever storm was coming. Spring crept into the mountain valley like a shy visitor, first touching the meadows with hints of green, then gradually warming the earth until purple wildflowers dotted the slopes. The morning air still carried winter's bite, but by midday, the sun coaxed life from the thawing ground. Mary Beth knelt in the small garden plot beside Louise's cabin, her fingers working the soil. She had insisted on helping prepare the earth for planting, despite Louise's concerns about her condition. The work felt good, purposeful and hopeful, like her mother's garden back home. "Reckon we could put the peas here," she said, pointing to a sunny patch. "And maybe some carrots along that border." Luis looked up from the fence post he was replacing nearby. His scarred face softened as he watched her plan the garden's future. Whatever you think best. Been a while since this plot saw proper tending. Mary Beth sat back on her heels, brushing dirt from her hands. Your wife kept a garden. Luis was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said softly, Sarah loved growing things. Used to say a garden was hope made visible. He drove another nail into the fence post with perhaps more force than necessary. Lost heart for it after she and the baby passed. Mary Beth's heart ached for the pain in his voice. Tell me about your hunting trips instead, she suggested gently. Must be quite different tracking game up here compared to the lowlands. Luis seemed grateful for the change of subject. As he worked on the fence, he described following elk trails through deep snow, reading the stories written in animal tracks, and learning the mountain's moods. His voice grew animated as he shared tales of outsmarting clever mountain lions and finding hidden springs. You speak of the land like it's alive, Mary Beth observed, carefully patting soil around some onion sets. Because it is. Luis paused, considering. Mountains have their own breath, their own ways. A man's got to learn to listen, or he won't last long up here. Like listening for God's voice, Mary Beth said softly. She reached for her mother's worn Bible, which she kept tucked in her apron pocket. Reminds me of something Mama used to read to me. From Psalms, the mountains and hills will burst into song before you. Luis's hands stilled on the fence post. Been a long time since I listened for that kind of voice, he admitted roughly. After Sarah, well, seemed like God went silent. Or maybe I just stopped wanting to hear. Mary Beth met his gaze steadily. Sometimes his voice comes through other people. Through kindness shown when we least expect it. Luis looked away first, but something in his expression had softened. They worked in comfortable silence until the sun began to slide behind the peaks. As evening approached, the sound of horses drew their attention. Henry appeared around the bend, leading 2 ponies. His wife Smallbird sat astride one, their daughters secured before and behind her. Brother, Henry called out in greeting. His dark eyes crinkled with warmth as he helped his family dismount. We brought fresh bread and stories to share. Smallbird approached Mary Beth with quiet dignity, her daughters half hiding behind her skirts. Welcome, sister, she said in careful English. My husband speaks well of you. Mary Beth felt tears prick her eyes at the simple kindness of being addressed as sister, rather than with the whispered accusations she'd endured in town. Thank you for coming, she managed. Please, come inside where it's warm. Luis built up the fire while Mary Beth set out cups and plates. Smallbird's bread was dark and fragrant, still warm from their own hearth. The 2 girls, gradually overcoming their shyness, peppered Mary Beth with questions about her baby and garden plans. As the evening deepened, Henry shared stories of his people's traditional ways of growing corn and squash. Smallbird added details about which plants should be companions, weaving English and Ute words together like bright threads. Their daughters drifted to sleep by the fire, peaceful and trusting. Later, while the women cleaned up from their shared meal, Henry drew Luis outside. Mary Beth could see them through the window, their faces grave in the fading light. Your neighbor Ephraim spreads poison in town, Henry said quietly. Claims you took his daughter by force, keep her prisoner here. Says the child she carries gives him rights he means to claim. Luis's jaw clenched, the scar along his cheek standing out white against his tanned skin. Man's got no honor, he growled, using his own flesh and blood as a pawn. He has the sheriff's ear, Henry warned, and money speaks louder than truth to some men. Be careful, brother. I won't let him harm her. Luis's voice was low but fierce. If he tries to take her or the child, violence will only prove his lies true in people's minds, Henry cautioned. There are other ways to fight. Mary Beth stepped onto the porch, then, unable to stay silent any longer. "I'll speak truth to any who ask," she declared firmly. "I'm here by choice, under Luis's protection. I won't let my father twist that into something ugly." Both men turned, startled by her quiet strength. Luis's expression held something like pride mixed with concern. "Your words carry weight," Henry agreed, "but Ephraim will try to discredit you, claim your condition makes you addled." "Then we'll face that too," Mary Beth said steadily. "God sees truth, even when men try to bury it." Luis moved to stand beside her, his presence solid and reassuring. "Together," he said simply. Smallbird appeared in the doorway, daughters drowsy in her arms. "Time we rode home," she said, "but we will return." Family stands together. Mary Beth's throat tightened at the word family. She watched as Henry helped his wife and children mount up, their shapes merging with the gathering dusk as they rode away. Later, as she prepared for bed, Mary Beth heard Luis moving about the cabin, checking locks and banking the fire. His quiet footsteps spoke of protection, not imprisonment. She touched her mother's Bible, drawing comfort from its familiar presence. "Thank you," she called softly through her door. There was a pause. Then Luis answered, "For what?" "For letting me choose to stay. For giving me dignity when others tried to take it." Another pause, longer this time. "You had dignity all along," Luis said finally. "I just refused to let anyone steal it from you." Mary Beth smiled in the darkness, feeling safer than she had since Thomas died. Whatever her father planned, she wasn't facing it alone anymore. She had found unexpected family here, in Luis's quiet strength, in Henry and Smallbird's acceptance, in the peace of the mountain valley itself. She drifted to sleep with her mother's psalm echoing in her mind. "The mountains and hills will burst into song before you, and all the trees of the field will clap their hands." The mountain afternoon stretched quiet and long when hoofbeats echoed up the trail. Luis stepped onto the cabin's porch, one hand resting near his belt as he watched the approaching rider. The circuit preacher's black coat and wide-brimmed hat marked him clearly against the spring-green aspens. Mary Beth appeared in the doorway behind Luis, wiping her hands on her apron. Her eyes lit up at the sight of the familiar figure. "That's Reverend Johnson," she whispered. "He used to visit our valley every season. Mama always said he was a man of true faith." Luis's shoulders remained tense as the preacher dismounted, but he nodded a greeting. "Welcome, Reverend. Long ride from town?" "Indeed it is, Mr. Cutter." Reverend Johnson's weathered face creased in a gentle smile. He led his horse to the water trough, speaking casually. "Beautiful country up here. Lord's handiwork clear in every vista." Mary Beth stepped forward, her hands clasped. "Would you take supper with us, Reverend? I've got a pot of bean soup that could stretch." The preacher's kind eyes took in her condition, but his smile never wavered. "Much obliged, Miss Dunn, or should I say Mrs. Dunn. I was mighty sorry to hear about Thomas's passing." Tears welled in Mary Beth's eyes at the mention of her late husband. "Thank you, sir. He was a good man." Luis cleared his throat. "Best come inside before the evening chill sets in." He took the preacher's horse to the lean-to stable, while Mary Beth hurried to set an extra place at the table. Inside the cabin, lamplight cast warm shadows as they shared the simple meal. The preacher broke cornbread and listened intently as Mary Beth hesitantly told their story. Her father's cruel rejection, Luis's unexpected intervention, the sanctuary she'd found in his mountain home. "And now," Reverend Johnson said carefully, "you find yourselves in an unusual situation." Luis stiffened, but the preacher held up a peaceful hand. "Peace, friend. I see God's hand at work here, not scandal. You've shown true Christian charity, Mr. Cutter." Done what any decent man would, Luis muttered, studying his coffee cup. No, Mary Beth said softly. Most men wouldn't have. Her hand rested protectively over her swelling belly. The preacher nodded thoughtfully. Still, there's the matter of protecting both your reputations, and more importantly, the child's future rights. Have you considered making this arrangement permanent in the eyes of both law and God? Luis's scarred face went still. Mary Beth's breath caught as she watched him, heart pounding. My wife, Luis said roughly. Sarah, she's only been gone 3 years. And you honor her memory through your kindness to others, the preacher said gently. But perhaps the Lord has brought you and Miss Dunn together for a purpose. Sometimes grace arrives in unexpected ways. Mary Beth gathered her courage. Luis, she said, voice trembling but firm. I don't want your pity. What I want, what I need, is dignity, a true home for my child. If that's not something you can offer with an open heart, I understand. Luis looked up then, meeting her eyes across the lamplight. Something shifted in his expression as he saw not just her fear, but her strength. Never been pity? He said quietly. You've brought life back to this cabin. Made it a home again. The preacher smiled. Then perhaps we should make it official. I'm here until tomorrow afternoon. Luis stood and walked to the window, staring out at the darkening mountains. When he turned back, his face was set with decision. Tomorrow morning, then? If that's what you want, Mary Beth. She nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. It is. I'll send word to Henry, Luis said. His family should witness. That night, Mary Beth lay awake in her bed, heart too full for sleep. Through the wall, she could hear Luis's restless pacing. Both of them were stepping into something new, something that required trust and courage. She pressed her hand to her belly, feeling the baby move, and whispered a prayer of thanksgiving. Morning dawned clear and bright. Henry arrived with Small Bird and their daughters just as the sun crested the peaks. Small Bird immediately went to help Mary Beth, who had put on her best dress, the blue one she'd worn to church before everything changed. It was tight across her middle now, but Small Bird's clever fingers adjusted it with quick stitches. You look beautiful, Small Bird said firmly when Mary Beth fretted about her size. Like Mother Earth, full of new life. Outside, in the mountain clearing beside the cabin, Luis had cleared a space among the spring wildflowers. He wore a clean shirt and had trimmed his beard. His eyes widened when Mary Beth emerged from the cabin. The ceremony was simple, but heartfelt. Reverend Johnson spoke of God's love taking many forms, of grace found in unexpected places. Henry's daughters scattered columbine petals while their parents stood witness. When it came time for the vows, Luis's strong hands trembled slightly as they held Mary Beth's. I take you as my wife, he said, voice rough with emotion. Before God and these witnesses, I promise to protect and cherish you and your child as my own family. Mary Beth's tears fell freely as she responded, I take you as my husband, grateful for your kindness turned to love. Before God and these witnesses, I promise to help make this cabin a true home, filled with faith and hope. The preacher pronounced them married, just as a shaft of morning sunlight broke through the trees, setting the dewdrops glittering like diamonds on the wildflowers. Small Bird had prepared a celebration meal, venison stew, cornbread, and wild berries preserved from last summer. They ate outside at the rough-hewn table Luis had made, sharing stories and laughter. Even Luis smiled more than usual, especially when Mary Beth unconsciously touched his arm while passing him more stew. As afternoon approached, the preacher saddled his horse for the ride back to town. The Lord works in mysterious ways, he told them, but love and courage always light the path. Henry's family left soon after, Small Bird embracing Mary Beth warmly. Sister, she said simply, including her fully in the family circle. The sun was setting when Louis and Mary Beth finally went inside their cabin, truly their shared home now. Louis lit the lamp while Mary Beth set out supper plates, their movements already falling into natural rhythm. "Thank you," she said softly as they sat down together. Louis reached across the table and took her hand. "No more thanks needed between us," he said. "We're family now." The lamplight gleamed soft and golden as they shared their first meal as husband and wife, while outside their mountain valley filled with the purple shadows of dusk. Spring melted fully into summer, bringing gentle rhythms to the mountain cabin. Moribeth's presence transformed the once sparse home with small touches that spoke of care and permanence. Her quiet humming filled the rooms as she worked, making even simple tasks feel blessed. Louis found himself watching her often, marveling at how naturally she fit into his world. Her soft determination reminded him of Sarah sometimes, but in a way that now brought comfort rather than pain. He spent extra hours in his workshop, crafting pieces to make her more comfortable, a carved rocking chair for the porch, shelves for her growing collection of dried herbs, a low stool to rest her feet while she worked at the stove. "You didn't have to," she said when he brought in the rocking chair, running her fingers over the smooth pine arms. "Wanted to," he replied simply, pleased at her obvious delight. "Baby's coming before winter. You'll need a proper place to rock it." Mary Beth's eyes grew misty as she settled into the chair. "It's perfect." She took up her mending, the gentle creak of wood matching the rhythm of her needle. The curtains she stitched from flour sacks brightened the windows, dancing in the mountain breeze. She'd carefully picked apart the seams and bleached the fabric before dyeing it with berries to make cheerful patterns. Louise helped her hang them, their hands brushing as they worked together. One evening, as sunset painted the cabin walls gold, Mary Beth gasped and pressed a hand to her rounded belly. "What's wrong?" Louis asked, instantly alert. "Nothing's wrong," she assured him, smiling. "The baby's kicking strong tonight. Would you like to feel?" Louis hesitated, then slowly knelt beside her chair. With tender reverence, he placed his broad, calloused hand where she guided it. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a firm push against his palm. "Lord above," he whispered, awe stealing his voice. Another kick, strong and certain. Mary Beth watched his face, saw wonder replace the old grief in his eyes. "That's our child," she said softly. Louis nodded, unable to speak. He remained kneeling, hand spread protective and gentle over the new life they sheltered together. The moment felt holy, like prayer. After Sarah and their baby died, he'd turned his back on faith, too angry at God to believe. But here, in the quiet cabin with Mary Beth and this miracle beneath his hand, he felt grace stirring again. "Thank you," he managed finally, voice rough with emotion. Mary Beth touched his cheek. "For what?" "For bringing life back. To the cabin? To me." She leaned forward and kissed his forehead, a gesture so natural it surprised them both. Then she began humming an old hymn her mother had sung, and Louis stayed where he was, hand resting on her belly, peace settling around them like a blessing. But peace, they discovered, could be as fragile as morning frost. 3 days later, they rode into town for supplies, their wagon loaded with pelts to trade. The summer morning had dawned clear and fine, but storm clouds gathered as they approached the settlement. "We'll make it quick," Louis said, noting how the townsfolk stared as they passed. The hostility felt sharper than usual. At the general store, Mrs. Peterson barely spoke while weighing their flour, though she'd always been kind to Mary Beth before. Outside, a crowd had begun gathering near the sheriff's office. "Something's wrong," Mary Beth whispered, clutching Louise's arm. They saw the notice as they passed, an official-looking document tacked beside the wanted posters. Louise's name stood out in bold letters, along with the word kidnapping. Below was Ephraim Dunn's signature, the ink still fresh. "He claims you took me against my will," Mary Beth said, voice shaking as she read, "that you're holding me prisoner for my inheritance rights." Angry mutters rose from the growing crowd. Someone spat in the dust near their wagon. "Ain't right," a man called out. "Taking advantage of a grieving widow?" "Should string him up," another voice added. Luis's hand went to his gun, but Mary Beth gripped his arm. "Please," she begged. "Let's just go home." He helped her quickly into the wagon, shielding her from the hostile stares. As they drove out of town, a few stones clattered against the wagon boards. Luis kept his eyes forward, jaw clenched tight, until they were well clear of the settlement. "I'll speak to them," Mary Beth said when they were halfway home. "Tell them the truth about Father, about us being properly married." "Won't matter," Luis said grimly. "Your father's got money and influence. He's turned the sheriff against us already." He'd seen Avery standing in his office doorway, watching them leave but making no move to stop the crowd's threats. That night, after Mary Beth had gone to bed, Luis sat beside the fireplace, his Winchester across his knees. The warrant was a lie, but it gave Ephraim legal cover to send men after them. They might come tonight, or tomorrow, or next week. But they would come. He checked his ammunition again, torn between two choices. He could stand and fight, defend his home and family with force. But that path likely ended with blood on the mountain, and Mary Beth taken anyway while he swung from a rope as a murderer. Or he could surrender, try to reason with the law. But Ephraim's money had already poisoned that well. The sheriff would lock him up and hand Mary Beth back to her father, her child destined to become a pawn in Ephraim's land schemes. The fire crackled low as Luis kept his vigil. From the bedroom came the soft sounds of Mary Beth's breathing, peaceful in sleep. He thought of the baby kicking against his palm, of hymns in the sunset and curtains dancing in the breeze. All the precious things he'd found again, when he'd thought joy was forever lost. "Lord," he whispered into the darkness, the word feeling strange after so long. "I don't know if you're listening, but please, show me how to protect them." The cabin creaked quietly around him as he waited through the long night, watching the shadows and praying for wisdom. Dawn painted the mountain peaks in pale gold when the thunder of hoofbeats shattered the morning quiet. Luis rose from his vigil by the dying fire, muscles stiff from the long night's watch. Through the cabin's small window, he counted 6 riders approaching. The sheriff and his deputies, rifles glinting in the early light. Mary Beth appeared in the bedroom doorway, her face drawn with worry. "They've come, haven't they?" Luis nodded, laying his Winchester carefully on the table. "Stay inside," he said softly. "Cutter." Sheriff Avery's voice boomed across the yard. "Come out peaceful-like. We got papers for your arrest." Luis straightened his shoulders and touched Mary Beth's cheek. Her skin felt cool against his palm. "Whatever happens," he murmured, "remember you're my wife before God and man both." "Don't go," she whispered, gripping his sleeve. "They'll hurt you." "If I resist, they'll have cause to shoot. Can't leave you alone like that." He pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead. "Trust in the Lord, even when I couldn't." Tears spilled down Mary Beth's cheeks as Luis stepped onto the porch, hands raised to show he carried no weapon. Morning mist curled around his boots while 6 rifles trained on his chest. "I'm coming quiet," he called. "No need for shooting." Sheriff Avery dismounted, spurs jingling. His deputies spread out, watching the cabin's windows. "Luis Cutter," Avery announced, unfolding an official paper. "You're charged with kidnapping and unlawful imprisonment of Mary Beth Dunn. Come down here for shackling." "That's a lie." Mary Beth burst onto the porch, one hand pressed to her swollen belly. "Luis saved me when my father tried selling me like cattle. We're properly married by Reverend Morrison himself." The sheriff wouldn't meet her eyes. Ma'am, your father's filed sworn statements about your confused state since your first husband's death. Says this man took advantage, forced you up here against your will." "I'll testify," Mary Beth started, but Louis shook his head slightly. "Won't matter, dear heart," he said quietly. "Papers are already signed. Law's made up its mind." He descended the porch steps slowly, boots crunching on gravel. When he reached the sheriff, he turned and offered his wrists. The iron shackles clicked shut, cold against his skin. "Louise, please," Mary Beth pleaded. She swayed suddenly, face going pale as she clutched her middle. "Easy now," Louise called to her, straining against the deputies holding his arms. "Remember what I said. God won't abandon us, even if I couldn't see it before. Keep faith for both of us." "Enough talk," Avery growled. "Mount up, boys." Mr. Dunn's waiting in town to collect his daughter. They forced Louis onto a spare horse, binding his feet beneath the belly. As they turned toward town, he twisted in the saddle for one last look. Mary Beth stood alone on the porch, her dark dress billowing in the mountain wind. She raised one hand in farewell, and Louis carried that image with him as the deputies urged their horses down the trail. The ride to town passed in grim silence. Townsfolk gathered to watch as they paraded Louis down the main street to the jailhouse. Some shouted insults, others simply stared. Louis kept his eyes forward, spine straight despite the weight of the shackles. Inside the jail, they pushed him into the last cell. The straw on the floor stank of mildew, and iron bars cast thin shadows in the morning light. "Enjoy your new home," one deputy sneered, slamming the door. "Reckon you'll hang before winter comes." Louis said nothing, watching them leave. Only when their footsteps faded did he sink to his knees in the dirty straw. For the first time since Sarah and their baby died, he felt tears burning his eyes. "Lord," he whispered hoarsely, "I turned my back on you when grief came, blamed you for taking them, lived bitter and alone until you sent Mary Beth to teach me love again." He pressed his shackled hands together. "I surrender my anger now, my grief. Just protect her and the child, please." The cell grew darker as afternoon faded to evening. Louis remained kneeling, prayer after prayer rising like smoke from a signal fire, hoping God still listened to a prodigal son. Meanwhile, across town, Mary Beth sat rigid in her father's formal parlor. The familiar furniture seemed colder now, the paintings on the walls more severe. Ephraim Dunn stood by the fireplace, watching her with narrow eyes. "You'll do as you're told now," he said, his voice silk over steel. "That mountain man's going to hang for kidnapping, and your child will inherit your late husband's land claim, under my guardianship, of course." "Louis is my husband," Mary Beth said quietly. "We spoke vows before God." Ephraim's hand cracked across her cheek, leaving a red mark. "That marriage is void. You were not in your right mind, grieving and carrying another man's child. The judge will see it my way." Mary Beth touched her stinging face, remembering Louise's gentle kisses. "God sees truth, Father, even when men twist it." "God," Ephraim sneered. "Where was God when your mother died? When your first husband was crushed in that rail yard? Face facts, girl. God helps those who help themselves, and I mean to help myself to every acre that child can claim." He stalked from the room, boots echoing on the polished floors. The key turned in the lock, leaving Mary Beth alone in the growing darkness. She eased herself onto a stiff horsehair sofa, one hand cradling her belly where the baby kicked restlessly. The parlor's heavy curtains blocked the last rays of sunset, but she didn't move to light the lamps. Instead, she began to pray in the darkness, her voice barely a whisper. "Lord, give me strength," she pleaded. "Give Louis comfort in his cell. Show us your path through this valley of shadows." She remembered Louis kneeling beside her chair, wonder replacing grief as he felt their child move. "You brought him back to faith through love. Don't let that light go out now. Please." Night settled heavily over the town. In his cell, Luis prayed on. In the parlor, Mary Beth whispered her own prayers. Between them stretched darkness and iron bars, but above them both, stars wheeled in the mountain sky, ancient light that had guided others through darker nights than this. Sunlight crept across the Persian carpet in Ephraim Dunn's formal parlor, highlighting dust motes that danced in the morning air. Mary Beth sat stiffly in a high-backed chair, her hands folded over her swollen belly, trying to hide the waves of discomfort that had started before dawn. A daughter should know her place, Ephraim lectured, pacing before the cold fireplace. Your mother understood that before she passed. Seems that mountain savage corrupted what little sense you had left after becoming a widow. Mary Beth closed her eyes against another contraction, disguising it as weariness from his endless sermon. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her pain, or worse, the triumph of controlling her child's birth. Are you even listening, girl? Ephraim's voice cracked like a whip. Yes, father. She kept her tone carefully neutral, though her insides cramped fiercely. Good. Because once that baby comes, things will be different. I've already arranged for proper guardianship papers. That child will be raised with respect for authority, not wild mountain ways. Across town in the jail's dim confines, Luis knelt in his cell, forehead pressed against the cold iron bars. His prayers, constant since dawn, fell silent at approaching footsteps. Brother Cutter? Pastor Elliott's gentle voice carried down the corridor. May I speak with you? Luis raised his head, seeing the preacher's kind face through the bars. Come to tell me God works in mysterious ways, Pastor. I've come because a man of faith shouldn't face darkness alone. The pastor settled onto the wooden stool outside the cell. Even when that faith feels far away. Faith? Luis's laugh held no humor. Where was faith when my Sarah and little James died of fever? Where is it now, with Mary Beth trapped in that snake's house? The same place it was when you offered dignity to a shamed woman in that saloon, Pastor Elliott said quietly. The same place it was when you chose mercy over vengeance, love over bitterness. Luis's shoulders slumped. I failed them, Pastor. My first family. Couldn't save them from the fever, and now I've failed Mary Beth too. You haven't failed anyone, son. The pastor's voice grew firm. Sarah and James were called home by God's timing, not your weakness. And Mary Beth? You gave her back her dignity when the world tried stealing it. That's not failure. That's redemption in action. Redemption? Luis whispered the word like a foreign language. Yes, redemption. God isn't finished writing your story yet, Brother Cutter. Keep faith. Keep praying. Mercy has a way of appearing when we least expect it. As evening approached, Mary Beth paced her old bedroom, one hand pressed against her lower back. The contractions were coming closer now, each one stealing her breath. Through the window, she watched her father stride toward the saloon, his evening ritual as predictable as sunset. A soft tap at the kitchen window made her turn. Sarah, Henry's wife, crouched in the growing shadows, pressing a folded paper against the glass. With trembling fingers, Mary Beth eased the window open just enough to grab the note. Run tonight, the hurried writing urged. Henry watches the mountain trail. We will help. Another contraction gripped her, stronger than before. Mary Beth bit her lip, tasting copper. The baby was coming, ready or not. She couldn't let her father control this birth, couldn't let him steal her child's future. Watching the street through lace curtains, she waited until full dark settled over the town. When the house creaked with evening quiet, she eased her bedroom door open. The hallway stretched empty before her, moonlight casting strange shadows through the windows. Mary Beth paused at the back door, gathering her courage. One hand cradled her belly while the other turned the latch. Cool night air rushed in, carrying the scent of pine from the distant mountains. Lord, give me strength, she whispered, stepping into the darkness. She moved as quickly as her condition allowed, using shadows and alleyways to avoid the deputies' lanterns that swept the main street. Each contraction forced her to stop, pressing against rough wooden walls until the pain ebbed. "Hold on, little one," she murmured, rubbing her belly. "Just a little longer." Voices approached, deputies on patrol. Mary Beth ducked behind stacked lumber as their lanterns swung past. "Keep searching," one called. "Dunn wants his daughter found if she tries running. Says she ain't thinking straight." "Thinking clearer than ever," Mary Beth whispered fiercely, easing out of hiding once they passed. She reached the edge of town, where rutted wagon tracks led toward the mountains. Another contraction dropped her to her knees in the dust. This one felt different, stronger, more urgent. The baby was coming soon. Lanterns bobbed in the distance as deputies widened their search. Mary Beth struggled to her feet, gasping. The mountain trail stretched before her, dark and daunting. But somewhere up there, Henry watched and waited. Somewhere up there lay freedom. Taking a deep breath, she stepped onto the trail. Each step brought fresh pain. Each minute carried her further from her father's reach. Behind her, deputies' voices grew louder, their lights spreading through the streets like hungry fireflies. Mary Beth pressed on into the darkness, one hand steadying herself against tree trunks, the other cradling her belly. Her child would be born free, even if she had to climb this mountain on her knees. Above her, stars wheeled in the vast mountain sky, ancient light guiding her way just as it had guided others seeking sanctuary in these hills. Another contraction seized her, but she didn't cry out. She was done being silent, done being controlled. Tonight she would find her own path. Mary Beth's boots sank into the melting snow, each step a battle against exhaustion and pain. The mountain trail twisted upward through dark pines, mud sucking at her feet as another contraction seized her body. She gripped a snow-laden branch, waiting for the wave to pass. "Just breathe," she whispered to herself, the words forming clouds in the cold air. "Lord, give me strength for each step." The trail ahead disappeared into shadow, but she couldn't stop. Behind her, distant lantern light flickered in the valley, deputies searching, getting closer. Her father's voice echoed in memory, hard as winter frost. "That child belongs to proper folk, not mountain trash." "No," Mary Beth gasped, straightening as the contraction eased. "This baby belongs to love, not schemes." She pressed forward, one hand steadying herself against rough tree trunks, the other cradling her belly. Melting snow soaked through her skirts, but the exercise kept her warm, until the next contraction dropped her to her knees. This one felt different, stronger, more urgent. The baby was coming soon, ready or not. Mary Beth bit back a cry, knowing sound carried far in these hills. Instead, she prayed, letting tears fall freely as she pushed herself back to her feet. Meanwhile, in the lamplit town below, Henry stood before Sheriff Avery's desk, his calm presence filling the small office. Behind him, Pastor Elliott and 3 respected ranchers waited, faces grim with purpose. "These papers," Henry said, laying out documents beside Ephraim's warrant, "show the truth. The kidnapping charge is false." Sheriff Avery shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Ephraim Dunn's word carries weight in this valley. Truth carries more." Henry's voice held quiet authority. "Here are witness statements from the saloon that night. Ephraim sold his own daughter. Louis Cutter showed her mercy, gave her shelter. Their marriage certificate bears the circuit preacher's seal." "And I performed that ceremony myself," Pastor Elliott added, stepping forward. "Before God and witnesses, they joined in lawful marriage." The sheriff studied the papers, running one hand through his graying hair. Ephraim claimed the marriage was forced under duress. "Ask yourself who truly used force," Henry replied. "The man who sold his daughter, or the one who gave her dignity?" One of the ranchers spoke up. "We've watched Ephraim's dealings for years, Sheriff. Man's got more tricks than a snake oil peddler. Time somebody stood against him." Sheriff Avery's shoulders slumped. Years of taking Ephraim's bribes had worn grooves in his conscience, but facing these witnesses stirred something long buried, a memory of the badge's true meaning. Marshall in Denver would be mighty interested in these land deed irregularities, another rancher added pointedly. The sheriff stood slowly. Reckon we better let Luis Cutter go. They found Luis on his knees in the cell, praying. He looked up as keys rattled in the lock, hope warring with wariness in his scarred face. "You're free to go," the sheriff muttered. "Charges were mistaken." Luis rose smoothly, eyes fixed on Henry. "Mary Beth?" "Fled her father's house hours ago," Henry answered. "Headed for the mountain trail." "She's in labor, brother." Luis's face hardened. Without another word, he strode from the jail, the others following. Outside, Henry's horse stood ready, stamping in the cold. "Take him," Henry said. "He knows the trail home." Luis swung into the saddle, then paused as Pastor Elliott gripped his arm. "Go with God, son. Bring them both home safe." The horse's hooves struck sparks from the street as Luis urged him toward the mountain path. Behind him, Henry organized men with lanterns, ready to follow and help once Luis found her. But this part of the journey was his alone, his chance at redemption. The trail grew steeper, mud giving way to patches of snow that glowed in the starlight. Luis kept his eyes sharp, reading signs that most men would miss. A broken branch here, fresh footprints there, places where someone had stopped to rest. "Mary Beth," he called softly, voice carrying through the pines. "I'm coming." A faint cry answered. Pain and hope mingled. Luis urged the horse faster, heart pounding. He found her collapsed beside the trail, clutching a snow-covered log, face contorted in another contraction. "Luis!" she gasped as he leaped from the saddle. "How did you—" "Henry brought truth to light," he said, gathering her gently in his arms. "Your father's lies couldn't stand against it." She buried her face in his shoulder, tears soaking his shirt. "The baby's coming." I tried to reach the cabin, but— "Shh," he soothed, lifting her carefully. "You don't have to do this alone." "Not ever again." Luis settled her on the horse, mounting behind her so she could lean back against his chest. He wrapped one arm securely around her while the other held the reins. As they started up the trail, the first pale light of dawn painted the snow-capped peaks ahead. Another contraction seized Mary Beth. She gripped Luis's arm, trying to breathe through the pain. "I was so afraid," she whispered when it passed. "Afraid Father would take the baby. Afraid I'd never see you again." "Fear's behind us now," Luis said firmly. "Look there. Sunrise coming. God's light chasing out the dark." Mary Beth managed a weak smile, then gasped as a stronger contraction hit. "Luis, the baby, it's really coming. Soon!" He urged the horse faster, knowing they had to reach the cabin's shelter. Below them, Henry's search party was visible on the lower trail, lanterns swaying like earthbound stars as they followed Luis's tracks. The sky lightened with each passing minute, revealing the beauty of the mountain morning. Fresh snow sparkled on pine boughs, and somewhere a morning bird called, "Welcome." Mary Beth relaxed slightly against Luis's chest between contractions, drawing strength from his solid presence. "Remember what you told me that first night?" she asked softly. "That I was safe under your roof?" "I meant it then," Luis replied, his voice rough with emotion. "Mean it even more now." "I know," she whispered. "God sent me to your door that night. Sent me home." The sun finally crested the eastern peaks, sending golden light spilling across the snow-touched landscape. Its warmth touched Mary Beth's face as another contraction began, stronger than before. She clung to Luis, no longer hiding her cries of pain. Together they climbed toward home, toward new life, while behind them the town stirred awake in the valley. Ephraim's schemes lay exposed in the morning light, his power broken by truth and courage. But up here on the mountain trail, none of that mattered to Luis and Mary Beth. All that mattered was each other, the baby coming, and the promise of love stronger than fear. The sunrise painted their path in hope as they made their way home. Not to Luis's cabin now, but to their cabin, their shelter, their future. The cabin's familiar walls welcomed them home as Luis helped Marybeth inside, her face tight with pain. Henry's wife Sarah was already there, having ridden ahead to prepare. She had water boiling on the stove and clean linens laid out on the bed. "Just in time," Sarah said, taking Marybeth's other arm as another contraction seized her. "The baby's ready to meet the world." Luis guided Marybeth to their bedroom, while snowflakes drifted past the window, coating the mountain world in hushed white. The morning light filtered softly through the glass, touching Marybeth's face as she gripped the bedpost, breathing hard. "I'm here," Luis whispered, supporting her weight. "I'm right here with you." Sarah moved with quiet efficiency, arranging pillows and checking the warmth of the water. "Henry's bringing more firewood. We'll keep it nice and warm in here." Marybeth nodded, unable to speak as another wave of pain washed over her. Luis held her hand, his heart clenching at her muffled cry. He had felt so helpless when his first wife died in childbirth, and that old fear clawed at his chest now. "Lord," he prayed silently, "I know I turned away after losing them, but please, please keep her safe." The hours crept by like years. Sarah encouraged Marybeth through each contraction, while Luis supported her, whispering words of love and strength. Outside, the snow continued falling, coating the window glass in delicate patterns of frost. "You're doing so well," Sarah soothed, wiping Marybeth's brow with a cool cloth. "The baby's moving down just like he should." Marybeth gripped Luis's hand tighter. "Tell me again," she gasped between pains. "Tell me what you said on the trail." "That you're safe," Luis said, his voice rough with emotion. "That we face this together." The room filled with the scent of pine as Henry added more wood to the stove. The warmth wrapped around them like a blanket while winter whispered at the windows. Marybeth's labor intensified, her cries growing stronger. Luis felt tears sliding down his cheeks as he watched her struggle. "Please, God," he prayed aloud this time. "Keep them both safe. I can't lose another family." Sarah checked Marybeth again, her experienced hands gentle. "The baby's almost here. When the next pain comes, you push with all your might." Marybeth nodded, her face flushed and determined. Luis supported her as she bore down, her whole body trembling with effort. The contraction peaked and passed, leaving her gasping. "I see the head," Sarah announced. "One more good push should do it." Luis held Marybeth close as the final contraction built. She grabbed his arms, crying out as she pushed. Then suddenly, gloriously, a new cry filled the cabin, sharp and strong, announcing new life. "A boy!" Sarah exclaimed, quickly wrapping the infant in warm linens. "A beautiful, healthy boy!" Luis trembled as he watched Sarah clean the baby, his vision blurring with tears. The child's wails grew stronger, full of vigor and life. When Sarah placed the wrapped bundle in his arms, Luis could barely breathe. "Look at him," he whispered, carefully laying their son in Marybeth's eager arms. "Look what God has given us." Marybeth sobbed as she cradled the baby, counting his fingers and toes through her tears. "Thank you, Lord," she breathed. "Thank you for this miracle." The infant's cries softened as he nestled against his mother's warmth. His tiny face, still red and wrinkled from birth, bore hints of both his parents. Marybeth's gentle mouth, Luis's strong brow. Sarah and Henry stood back, sharing knowing smiles. This child represented more than just new life. He was living proof of love's triumph over greed and cruelty. Ephraim's schemes to control the land through his grandson would never succeed now. The baby was Luis's son in the eyes of both law and God. As Sarah helped Marybeth clean up and settle more comfortably, Luis stumbled to the main room. His legs felt weak, his heart so full it might burst. Henry clasped his shoulder in silent support. "God is good," Henry said simply. Luis nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. After years of bitter grief, after turning his back on faith and hope, here was redemption in its purest form. A new family, a second chance. The afternoon faded into evening while mother and child rested. Luis crafted a makeshift cradle from a drawer padded with quilts, placing it near the bed where Mary Beth could reach out and touch their sleeping son. Henry and Sarah prepared to leave as darkness fell, promising to return tomorrow with food and supplies. "The storm's letting up," Henry observed. "Stars coming out?" Luis walked them to the door, gratitude overwhelming him. "We can never repay you both." Sarah hugged him warmly. "Family helps family. That's all there is to it." After they left, Luis built up the fire and carried a lamp to the bedroom. Mary Beth lay propped on pillows, watching their son sleep. The lamplight cast a gentle glow over them both. "Come sit with us," she said softly. Luis settled in the chair beside the cradle, his hand finding hers. The baby made tiny sounds in his sleep, perfect fingers curling and uncurling. "I was so afraid," Luis admitted quietly. "When I lost Rebecca and our little girl, I blamed God. Shut myself away from everything. But watching you today, seeing our son born," his voice broke. "I felt his presence again. His mercy." Mary Beth squeezed his hand. "He never left you, Luis. He was just waiting for your heart to heal." Outside, the storm had passed completely. Through the window, stars blazed in the crystal-clear mountain sky, diamonds scattered on velvet. Their light touched the fresh snow with silver, making the world seem new-made and full of promise. Luis watched his son's peaceful face, overwhelmed by love and gratitude. Here was his redemption, his restoration. Here was proof that after the darkest storm, grace still waited. That bitter hearts could heal. That love could bloom again from frozen ground. The cabin held them safe in its wooden embrace, while the fire crackled softly. Luis bowed his head, tears falling freely now as years of grief finally gave way to joy. His whispered prayer rose like incense in the quiet room. "Thank you, Lord. Thank you for bringing them home to me." Dawn painted the mountain peaks in soft rose and gold as hoofbeats echoed up the trail. Luis stood at the cabin window, his newborn son cradled against his chest. The baby slept peacefully, tiny fingers curled around his father's rough shirt. "They're coming," he said quietly to Mary Beth, who sat propped in the rocking chair nearby. She had insisted on being up, though the birth was barely a day past. "I hear them," she whispered, reaching for Luis's hand. "But I'm not afraid anymore." Through the frosted glass, they watched riders appearing through the morning mist. Ephraim led the group, his face dark with fury. The sheriff rode beside him, looking less certain. But behind them came an unexpected sight. Nearly 20 townsfolk on horseback, including Pastor Elliot and Henry's family. "What in heaven's name?" Mary Beth breathed. Luis carefully passed their son to her and stepped onto the porch. The crisp mountain air carried the scent of pine and wood smoke as the riders approached. Henry broke away from the group first, dismounting to stand beside Luis. "We brought witnesses," Henry said simply. "Truth needs telling." Ephraim reined his horse to a stop, scowling at the gathered crowd. "This is a legal matter between me and that kidnapper," he spat. "The rest of you got no business here." "That's where you're wrong, Dunn." Pastor Elliot's normally gentle voice rang firm as he stepped forward. From his saddlebag, he drew a stack of papers. "We have proof of your forgery. The warrant you filed against Luis was based on false testimony." The sheriff shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "What proof?" Sarah, Henry's wife, produced a letter. "This is from the clerk who witnessed Ephraim bribing men to sign false statements. He confessed everything." More voices rose from the crowd. The general store owner described seeing Ephraim threaten potential witnesses. A ranch hand admitted being offered money to lie about Luis's character. One by one, the truth emerged like sunrise clearing away shadows. Luis stood quietly through it all, his eyes never leaving Ephraim. He saw the older man's face grow mottled with rage and fear as his schemes crumbled. "Sheriff," Pastor Elliott said, "you have a duty to justice, not to wealthy men's gold." The sheriff looked from the evidence to Ephraim's thunderous face. Finally, he straightened in his saddle. "The warrant is withdrawn," he declared. "There's no cause for arrest here." "No," Ephraim roared. "That child is my blood, my property." "No man owns another's soul," Luis said, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "Not a father, not a husband, not a master." He turned and gestured to Mary Beth, who had appeared in the doorway with their son. "They are free people under God's law and man's. Your authority over them is finished." Ephraim's hand moved toward his gun, but the sheriff's deputies stepped forward, hands on their own weapons. "Don't make it worse for yourself, Dunn," the sheriff warned. For a long moment, Ephraim sat rigid in his saddle, trapped between rage and reality. Then something seemed to crack in him. His shoulders sagged, his face grew slack with defeat. "You're all fools," he snarled, but his voice wavered. "Soft-hearted weaklings." He yanked his horse's head around, digging in his spurs. The animal leaped forward, carrying him down the trail at a dangerous pace. No one moved to follow. Mary Beth stepped out onto the porch, tears streaming down her face. "Is it truly over?" she whispered. Luis wrapped his arm around her and their son. "Yes," he said softly. "You're free. Both of you." The gathered crowd began dismounting, faces bright with relief and friendship. Sarah hurried forward to check on Mary Beth and the baby, while Henry and the pastor clasped Luis's hand. "Thank you all," Luis said, his voice rough with emotion. "We owe you more than we can say." "You owe us nothing," the pastor replied warmly. "Standing together against injustice is what makes a community strong." Luis looked out at the familiar faces, people who had once whispered about him in fear, who had judged Mary Beth harshly, now gathered in support. His heart swelled with gratitude. "Please," he said, "come inside, all of you. Share our fire, and meet our son properly." The small cabin filled with warmth and voices as people crowded in. Sarah and other women fussed over Mary Beth and the baby, while men stamped snow from their boots and accepted cups of coffee. Henry's children played peekaboo with the infant, making him coo and wave his tiny fists. The sheriff lingered awkwardly by the door until Luis approached him. "I'm sorry," the lawman said gruffly. "I should have questioned things sooner." Luis nodded. "What matters is you chose right in the end." As morning stretched toward noon, people began heading home, leaving with handshakes and promises to return soon. Henry's family stayed to help with chores and prepare a proper meal. The afternoon passed peacefully, filled with quiet conversation and the comfortable sounds of life being lived. That evening, after their guests had gone, Luis and Mary Beth sat together by the fire. Their son nursed contentedly, his small face illuminated by the dancing flames. "You know what I realized today?" Luis said softly, watching them. "What's that?" His very first breath was freedom. Not chains, not bitterness, not revenge, just pure freedom. Mary Beth looked up at him, eyes shining with tears and joy. "Like Grace," she whispered. "Like Grace," Luis agreed. She reached up and pulled him down for a tender kiss, their son cradled safely between them. Outside, stars began appearing in the darkening sky, while inside the cabin love and mercy had truly conquered all. The mountain morning dawned clear and cold, sunlight sparkling on fresh snow outside the cabin windows. Inside, warmth radiated from the crackling hearth where Mary Beth sat in her rocking chair, their tiny son nestled against her chest. Her soft humming mingled with the steady rhythm of Luis's carving tools as he worked on the cradle, wood shavings curling at his feet. "See how your papa makes something beautiful," she whispered to the baby, who watched Luis with wide, dark eyes. "Just like he made our lives beautiful." Luis paused in his work, touched by her words. The rough-hewn cradle was taking shape beneath his hands, each careful stroke of the knife transforming plain pine boards into something precious. He'd carved vines and leaves along the sides, remembering how Marybeth loved the wild roses that grew near the creek in summer. "It needs to be strong," he said, running his hand along the smooth wood. "Like his mama." Marybeth's eyes grew misty. "And gentle like his papa, though some folks wouldn't believe that of you." Luis smiled, remembering how the townspeople had once whispered about the scarred mountain man who kept to himself. Now those same people stopped by regularly, bringing small gifts and kind words for the baby. The morning passed peacefully as Luis worked. Marybeth sang hymns in her sweet, clear voice while she nursed their son. The familiar melodies filled the cabin with joy, making Luis's heart swell with gratitude. He'd forgotten how music could lift the spirit during his years of solitude. Near midday, they heard horses approaching. Luis stepped to the window, relaxing when he recognized Pastor Elliot's dappled mare. The pastor dismounted carefully, carrying a small cloth-wrapped bundle. "Good day to you both," he called as Luis opened the door. "I've come to properly bless this child of grace." Marybeth straightened in her chair, beaming. "Pastor, you're always welcome here." The older man stomped snow from his boots and came to warm his hands by the fire. His kind eyes crinkled as he looked at the baby. My, how he's grown already. Strong and healthy, praise be. They gathered around the hearth as the pastor opened his Bible. Outside, snow began falling softly, adding to the reverent hush that filled the cabin. The baby watched solemnly as Pastor Elliot sprinkled water on his forehead, speaking ancient words of blessing. "Remember always," the pastor said when the ceremony was done, "that mercy triumphed where vengeance might have ruled. This child was born in love, not bitterness. That's God's greatest victory." Luis nodded, thinking of how close he'd come to letting anger consume him after losing his first family. "The Lord gives second chances," he said quietly, "even to broken men." "Especially to broken men," the pastor replied with a gentle smile. He unwrapped his bundle, revealing a small hand-woven blanket. "From the ladies' sewing circle. They want you to know you're not alone anymore." Marybeth ran her fingers over the soft wool, tears spilling down her cheeks. So much kindness, when once there was only judgment. They shared a simple meal with the pastor before he had to ride on to his next parish. As he mounted up, he looked back at the family framed in the doorway. "God's light shines bright from this cabin now," he said, "a beacon of hope for others who need it." The afternoon brought more visitors, Henry's 2 daughters trudging through the snow with their mother. The girls had brought tiny moccasins they'd helped their mother make, decorated with careful beadwork. "For the little one," the older girl said shyly, placing them in Marybeth's hands. "So, he'll walk in beauty." "Such a precious gift," Marybeth exclaimed, hugging them both. "You must teach me how to make these when he outgrows them." The cabin filled with chatter and laughter as the girls took turns holding the baby, supervised by their watchful mother. Luis stepped outside to split more firewood, his heart light as he listened to the happy sounds drifting through the walls. Once, he'd thought he'd never know such joy again. When evening fell, their visitors departed with promises to return soon. Luis built up the fire, while Marybeth prepared their son for sleep. Golden lamplight spilled from the windows onto the snow outside, making the cabin glow like a jewel in the gathering dark. "Look," Marybeth said softly, pointing through the glass. "Our light shines all the way down the mountain. Remember when we first came up this trail, I was so frightened, not knowing if I'd found shelter or something worse." Luis wrapped his arms around her and their drowsing son. "God knew what he was doing, even if we didn't." "He surely did." She leaned her head against his shoulder, her voice thick with emotion. "What began as punishment has become my greatest blessing. This cabin, this life with you, our precious boy. It's more than I ever dared hope for." Luis pressed a kiss to her hair, his own eyes growing damp. "God gave us a family," he whispered. "He made something beautiful from our broken pieces." They stood together at the window, watching snow fall in the lamplight. Their son made small sleeping sounds against Mary Beth's chest, perfectly peaceful. Outside, the night was deep and cold, but inside their cabin, love and faith had built an unshakable warmth. Luis looked around at the home they'd made together, the carved cradle waiting for their son, the quilt Mary Beth had mended, the hearth that never grew cold. Every corner held evidence of healing, of second chances, of love stronger than bitterness. "Shall we sing him one more hymn before bed?" Mary Beth asked softly. Luis nodded, and their voices joined together in the quiet night, giving thanks for all that had been restored. Thanks for tuning in. These stories remind us that life is more than headlines. It's about heartlines. Subscribe if you want more moments that make you pause, feel, and reflect.